There is a question that many people have never dared to ask, even though it repeats itself in their lives every single day. Why do you work harder than your parents, study more than they did, follow the rules more closely than they ever had to, yet feel less financially secure than ever before? You do not waste money. You are not lazy. You do everything society says a responsible person should do. So why does life still feel like a constant struggle, and the future remains so uncertain? The answer we often hear is that you are not trying hard enough, not disciplined enough, or not good at managing money. But if that were true, why are millions of people making the exact same mistake at the same time? Not just one generation, but several generations in a row. Not just in one country, but across most developed economies. The uncomfortable truth is that the problem is not you. The problem is the game you are being forced to play. We grow up believing, almost without question, that the modern financial system is built to reward hard work and discipline. That if you show up every day, save your money, avoid debt, and follow the law, you will gradually move forward. What very few people tell you is that this same system is designed with two completely different sets of rules. One for the majority, and another for a small group at the top. The original video we are examining is not about luck, and it is not about exceptional talent. It is about a very specific mechanism, entirely legal, that has existed for decades. A mechanism you will almost never see if you are not positioned correctly inside the system. But if you are inside it, it becomes a massive advantage, repeated over and over again, almost impossible to lose. It is important to say this clearly from the beginning. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not a sensational story about a secret group controlling the world. Everything we are about to discuss is documented in financial reports, academic research, and the public records of the modern financial system itself. It exists in plain sight, hidden behind complex language, technical terminology, and advice that sounds harmless. Most people do not fail because they do something wrong. They fail because they do exactly what they were taught, while the real rules quietly favor an entirely different group. And when you do not know that two games are being played at the same time, you will always assume the fault is yours. This part is not meant to make you blindly angry. It is meant to lay the foundation for a deeper truth. Before you try to fix your behavior, you need to understand the structure. Before you blame yourself, you need to look directly at the system. And now, we begin to peel back that underlying mechanism, layer by layer, clearly, without avoidance. My name is Alex, and I've spent far too much time digging into how money and assets actually work, not in textbooks or popular financial advice, but in the real world where major decisions are made. If you are exhausted from watching people at the top get richer with ease, while you calculate every bill and every small expense just to stay afloat, then subscribe to this channel and hit like if what you are about to hear helps you see how this game is truly designed. The mechanism discussed in the original video is not a new trick. It is a core part of the modern financial system, built decades ago and legalized through laws, banks, and capital markets. What matters is that the way this mechanism is presented to the public is completely different from how it is used by those inside the system. Ordinary people are taught that money is something you earn through labor, preserve through saving, and lose if you borrow too much. But in the world of large asset holders, money is not just income. It is a tool. It is leverage. And most importantly, it is something you can use without selling what you own. The biggest mistake the crowd makes is believing that everyone is on the same financial path, just moving at different speeds. They assume the wealthy are simply moving faster on the same road. The original video reveals a more uncomfortable truth. The wealthy are not moving faster. They are on an entirely different road. While ordinary people sell their time for money and then use that money to consume and save, those at the top focus first on accumulating assets. These assets do not just appreciate over time. They are accepted by the financial system as collateral, allowing access to cheap capital. And when you can borrow at low cost using your assets, the entire relationship between debt and risk changes. The rules allow this because, legally, secured lending is considered lower risk. Banks do not look first at your monthly income. They look at the value of the assets you hold. That means the same loan is treated very differently depending on where you sit in the system. The original video emphasizes that this is not an accidental loophole. It is a deliberately designed feature. The system encourages asset accumulation at the top because it is seen as stabilizing for financial markets. The price paid is that the rest of society is forced to live off income, pay direct taxes, and absorb greater risk whenever the economy shifts. When you have no assets, every financial decision is defensive. You fear borrowing because you fear default. You fear investing because you fear loss. You fear risk because you have no cushion. When you are inside this mechanism, risk is spread out, costs are reduced, and the system itself works to protect you. This is the foundation of the entire story. Without understanding this, all financial advice that follows becomes meaningless. You cannot win a game if you do not know its real rules. And in the next part, we reach the most important turning point, where this mechanism is no longer theoretical, but operates like a machine that creates repeated advantage over time. If you still think the difference comes down to higher income, this is where everything flips. The original video does not say that people at the top earn more money in the traditional sense. It shows that they use money differently, and that difference creates a gap that cannot be closed. The turning point lies in a decision that sounds almost trivial. Instead of selling assets when they need cash, they borrow against those assets. Instead of turning assets into taxable cash, they keep them, let them continue to grow, and use them as leverage to access cheap capital. This is where conventional financial logic is completely reversed. For ordinary people, debt equals risk. Debt is something to avoid at all costs. But for those with substantial assets, debt becomes a strategic tool. When assets grow faster than borrowing costs, borrowing is mathematically safer than selling. The original video uses this logic to explain why many wealthy individuals almost never sell their assets over their lifetime. Imagine a simple scenario aligned with the original content. Someone owns a large asset portfolio that steadily increases in value. When they need money to spend or reinvest, they do not sell the assets. They use them as collateral to borrow at low interest. During that time, the assets continue to appreciate. The loan is serviced or refinanced. The loop repeats. Their risk is not tied to short-term fluctuations. It is spread over decades. Someone living off income does not have this privilege. Every economic shock hits directly. One job loss, one health issue, or a period of rising interest rates can trigger a crisis. The original video stresses that this advantage does not come from superior intelligence. It comes from position. Once you are inside the asset system, banks treat you differently. The law treats you differently. Markets treat you differently. You are not taxed when you borrow. You are not forced to realize gains. Time is on your side. Ordinary people cannot copy this strategy easily, not because they do not understand it, but because they lack the starting point. No large assets, no access to cheap capital, no patience from the system. Every small mistake is punished immediately. The most critical insight here is the self-reinforcing loop. Assets create borrowing power. Borrowing power preserves assets. Preserved assets enable long-term growth. Growth strengthens borrowing power again. Once this loop starts, it is extremely difficult to break from the outside. This is not magic. It is mathematics plus rules. And once you see that, you understand why asset inequality cannot be solved by saving tips or working harder. But theory only goes so far. To feel this fully, we need to see it play out in real life. That is where we turn to a fictional character whose story unfolds over decades. Imagine someone we will call Michael. Michael is not a genius. He did not win the lottery. He did not invent anything revolutionary. He simply started life in a slightly different position. When he was young, Michael had access to enough initial capital to acquire his first assets. Not because he worked harder, but because he was placed where asset accumulation could begin early. In the early years, his life did not look extraordinary. He worked. He spent. He lived modestly. The difference was that most of his value was not in a paycheck, but in assets quietly appreciating over time. In the first 5 years, Michael did not feel richer. His income grew slowly. His lifestyle stayed restrained. But behind the scenes, his assets were becoming trusted by the financial system. When major decisions arose, he did not sell assets. He borrowed against them. Around year 10, the economy entered a downturn. Jobs were lost. Families were forced to sell assets at the worst time. Michael was not. His loans were long-term. His assets were not forced onto the market. He had time, and time became his shield. Now compare this with someone we will call David. David did everything society recommended. He studied responsibly. He worked hard. He saved cash consistently. When trouble hit, his only options were limited savings or expensive consumer debt. Every decision was about survival, not strategy. 20 years later, Michael had still never sold most of his assets. His net worth grew not because he worked more, but because the system allowed his assets to grow while he lived off low-cost borrowing. Loans were refinanced, restructured, and normalized as part of his life. David's path looked different. Every job change, every downturn left a financial scar. Savings were depleted. Investment opportunities arrived too late when risk tolerance was gone. David was not poor because he was lazy. He was poor because he never entered the asset loop Michael lived inside for decades. The lesson here is not moral, it is structural. Once you are inside the loop, the system does the work. Outside of it, every mistake is yours to absorb. Michael's story is not rare. It is replicated at scale, and when millions of such stories coexist, they create a society that looks nothing like what we were taught to expect. That is when we have to move beyond individual stories and examine the broader impact. Viewed individually, this may look like different life choices, but repeated millions of times, it becomes a force that reshapes society. At scale, the financial system does not just allow this asset loop, it actively supports it. Banks design products for asset holders. Capital markets favor stability in large portfolios. Policy messaging consistently frames asset protection as necessary for economic stability, individually reasonable. Together, they create a system where advantage flows upward. The result is asset prices rising faster than wages. Housing, stocks, land move further out of reach for income-dependent households, not because they are irresponsible, but because they compete in markets where others can borrow cheaply, wait longer, and absorb less risk. When assets become borrowing tools, demand is no longer tied to real income. Another uncomfortable reality the original video highlights is crisis response. When the system is threatened, it is rescued to prevent collapse. Institutions are deemed too important to fail, but workers and small households receive no such protection. They absorb the shock through layoffs, foreclosures, and lost future opportunity. Why regulators do not intervene more aggressively is not a mystery. The mechanism is embedded in law and markets. Changing it would shake the entire structure. And in a world where short-term stability is prioritized over long-term fairness, reform is endlessly delayed. The outcome is a society where risk is pushed downward and advantage is preserved upward. Ordinary people are told to be more flexible, more disciplined, more resilient, while the larger forces remain unchanged. This does not cause immediate collapse. It causes slow erosion. Trust in economic fairness fades. And when that trust disappears, the question is no longer who works harder. It becomes whether this game was ever meant for everyone. After walking through this entire journey, one truth remains unavoidable. The game was never fair from the start, not because of hidden cheating, but because the rules were written to favor those already positioned at the top. Once you understand this, many confusing feelings about your financial life begin to make sense. You did not fail because you were incompetent. You did not fall behind because you lacked discipline. You are playing a game where risk is pushed downward and time and patience are reserved for the top. When you live off income, every small misstep carries consequences. Inside the asset loop, waiting and adjustment are allowed. The original video does not ask you to rage or despair. It asks you to see clearly. Only by understanding the structure can you make better decisions within your control. You may not change the rules today, but you can stop blaming yourself for failures that were never purely personal. The most important shift this story offers is not a get-rich strategy. It is a shift in awareness. Once you understand how the system works, you become more cautious with simplified advice, more skeptical of narratives that blame individuals. You start asking better questions instead of fixing the wrong problems. If this video helped you see how the game truly works, share it with others who quietly wonder why they always feel behind, despite doing everything right. Not to spread pessimism, but to bring clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the most important first step toward not continuing down the wrong path.